Right, so our topic for today, for the next couple of sessions, is morality in non-human animals. And one thing this does is it sort of forms a transition from our discussion of utilitarian ethics to our discussion of deontological ethics, because as you'll see, what we have here is a contrast between sort of broadly utilitarian pro-animal position as defended by Peter Singer, and this broadly deontological anti-animal position defended by Tibor Machin. I mean, I don't want to say that it's necessarily the case that moral theories and positions on animals line up that way, but they certainly do with the particular authors that we have here. Right. I've got one of those little agenda slides. You might as well look at it quick, just previewing what we're going to do here. All right. The philosopher then whose articulation of a sort of pro-animal position we're going to look at is Peter Singer. Singer is perhaps the most high-profile contemporary philosopher, right? I mean, he's very well regarded by professional philosophers, though he's not necessarily taken to be sort of the most profound or something. But, I mean, his high profile is a matter of his work being known outside professional philosophical circles in a way that the work of, I would say, no other contemporary philosopher is. So, Singer is the most important figure in the what you might call the practical ethics movement. That is the movement of philosophers sort of seriously addressing controversial topics in applied ethics, topics like abortion and euthanasia and the treatment of animals and so forth. And probably he's most celebrated for his work on two issues, one of which is famine and moral obligation. So he's very famously argued for much more stringent duties of aid for those like us who live in wealthy countries, to provide aid for people starving in poor countries. But the other thing he's most famous for is his work on animals, arguing for this as we'll say, pro-animal position, arguing for the view that the interests of animals ought to be taken much more seriously than we ordinarily take them. Singer's presented his pro-animal position, in lots of places. The argument that he gives in almost every case, and certainly the version we have, has a kind of standard form, right? It's a standard form we've actually already encountered because it's the form that Marquis imitates in his anti-abortion argument, and actually, as I pointed out a bit ago, it's actually the form also of Rachel's preferred argument against ethical egoism. Right? So what this argument form has is it has kind of two stages, right? So in the first stage, what we do is we attempt to argue for, justify a principle without specific application to the issue that ultimately interests us, right? So, for instance, as that worked in the Marquist thing, the idea was you defend a principle about the wrongness of killing without directly thinking about abortion at all, right? Then, in the second stage, what you do is you argue that, properly understood, this principle has clear, though maybe unexpected, implications for the topic you are ultimately interested in. So that's sort of the structure. So we have Singer presenting this sort of argument in this piece, this extract from his book Animal Liberation, entitled All Animals Are Equal, starting on page 120 of The Right Thing to Do. Right? So he begins, as he characteristically does, with issues of equality among humans, right? He begins with questions of inequality, discrimination against women or against people of different races, right? And what he says is, in effect, we're all now committed to the principle that all human beings are equal, but we need to understand what this principle means, right? You need to understand sort of how to interpret it, right? And what he does is he considers a couple of interpretations which he thinks don't work, right? So look first at 122. So there's sort of a middle paragraph, and I'll start about the middle of that paragraph. He says, to make this clear, we need to see first exactly why racism and sexism are wrong. When we say that all human beings, whatever their race, creed, or sex, are equal, what is it that we are asserting? Those who wish to defend hierarchical, inegalitarian societies have often pointed out that by whatever test we choose, it simply is not true that all human beings are equal. Like it or not, we must face the fact that humans come in different shapes and sizes. They come with different moral capacities, differing intellectual abilities, different amounts of benevolent feeling and sensitivity to the needs of others, different abilities to communicate effectively, and different capacities to experience pleasure and pain. In short, if the demand for equality were based on the actual equality of all human beings, we would have to stop demanding equality. So the idea there is the principle that all human beings are equal that cannot mean, at least if it's to be justified or reasonable, the claim that, in every respect, people's abilities or capacities are the same, because that's false. Right? Then Singer considers a different interpretation where he says he takes this principle instead to mean, there are no systematic differences between people based on, race or sex or whatever. Right? And he thinks again, and I won't, unless you press me fully, go into those reasons. He thinks again, though, that won't do as an interpretation of the principle of equality that properly justifies our opposition to discrimination among humans. He concludes then that the proper way to understand what this principle of equality to which we're committed is that you've got to understand that it is a moral principle rather than a factual claim, right? And then he tells you how to understand this moral principle. So this is 124, start with the italicized bit at the end of the first full paragraph and then go on to the next paragraph. So he says, the principle of the equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat human beings. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of the reforming Utilitarian school of moral philosophy, incorporated the essential basis of moral equality into his system of ethics by means of the formula, each to count for one and none for more than one. In other words, the interest of every being affected by an action would be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interest of any other being. A later utilitarian, Henry Sidgwick, put the point in this way. The good of any one individual is of no more importance, from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe, than the good of any other. More recently, the leading figures in contemporary moral philosophy have shown a great deal of agreement in specifying as a fundamental presupposition of their moral theories some similar requirement that works to give everyone's interest equal consideration, although these writers generally cannot agree on how this requirement is best formulated. Okay. So that's sort of the first stage of the argument then, right? So there what Singer does is he claims, sort of, in order to justify our opposition to racism and sexism, right, you have to understand us as committed to this principle of equal consideration of interests. Right? So this principle of equal consideration of interest is justified because it's the only principle that explains, gives reasons why we shouldn't discriminate among human beings. So far no sort of direct, explicit, necessary reference to the animal's case at all. Right? We just committed ourselves to this principle of equal consideration of interest. Right? So that's the first stage of the argument. Right? But then what Singer wants to do is to argue. Once you properly understand this principle, once you understand what it commits you to, what it contains, you'll see that you're also committed to equal consideration for the interests of non-human animals. And you see him making this transition starting at the bottom of page 125 now. In making the transition, he quotes this very famous footnote from Bentham. He sets up the historical background to this footnote from Bentham, but let me be explicit too before I read it here. What's going on, right? So, at the point at which Bentham was writing, at the point at which he wrote, this footnote, right? Slavery had been abolished in French colonies, but not in British colonies and former British colonies like the United States. Right? I mean, that's the historical background. All right. So, making the transition, developing this key second part of the argument, quoting Bentham, starting at the very bottom of 125, Singer writes, many philosophers and other writers have proposed the principle of equal consideration of interest in some form or other as a basic moral principle. But not many of them have recognized that this principle applies to members of other species as well as to our own. Jeremy Bentham was one of the few who did realize this. In a forward-looking passage, written at a time when black slaves had been freed by the French, but in the British dominions were still being treated in the way we now treat animals, Bentham wrote, "The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights, which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may one day come to be recognized that the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational, as well as a more conversable animal, than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose they were otherwise. what would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? In this passage, Bentham points to the capacity for suffering as the vital characteristic that gives a being the right to equal consideration. The capacity for suffering, or more strictly for suffering and or enjoyment or happiness, is not just another characteristic like the capacity for language or higher mathematics. Bentham is not saying that those who try to mark the insuperable line that determines whether the interests of a being should be considered happen to have chosen the wrong characteristic. By saying that we must consider the interest of all beings with the capacity for suffering or enjoyment, Bentham does not arbitrarily exclude from consideration any interest at all, as those who draw the line with reference to the possession of reason or language do. The capacity for suffering and enjoyment is a prerequisite for having interest at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in a meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interests of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. A stone does not have interest because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we can do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. The capacity for suffering and enjoyment is, however, not only necessary, but also sufficient for us to say that a being has interests, at an absolute minimum an interest in not suffering. A mouse, for example, does have an interest in not being kicked along the road, because it will suffer if it is. Skipping a couple of paragraphs, to which we'll come back, actually, in connection with Mackham, but we'll leave them for now. So starting with a paragraph that starts just below the middle on 127, Singer writes, "If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with the like suffering, insofar as rough comparisons can be made, of any other being." Okay, so there's the core of Singer's argument. Again, it's this two-stage argument, right? First stage, sort of justify the principle of equal consideration of interest without any special reference to animals, right? Then, second stage, argue that this principle, properly understood, commits you to animal equality, right? All right, so let me now give you a version of this for your notes. So this will be a formulation of the argument that will come in a couple of slides, right? So on this first slide, I've got sort of the first stage of the argument, right? Everyone got this bit down? Okay. All right. So here's the second half of the argument coming up then. Okay, right, everyone got this down? All right, now, in that formulation I've just given you, I've referred to this principle of equal consideration of interest. I haven't there given you yet an explicit formulation of it. Now, Singer in this piece we have doesn't exactly himself pick on a single formulation and say this is the best way to state the principle. But I do think, if you look at what he says in the paragraph where he introduces it, there is, as it were, a leading candidate, right? So the paragraph, as we saw, where he introduces the principle is the middle paragraph on 124, right? And seems to me, if you look at that middle paragraph on 124, probably the best sentence to take to give the canonical formulation of the principle of equal consideration of interest is the second sentence, the one between the Bentham quote and the Sidgwick quote, right? Where he says, in other words, the interest of every being affected by an action is to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interest of any other being. So that, I think, is how you should understand or formulate the principle of equal consideration of interest. So I've got a statement of that there for you. You want to append that right to your notes on the argument, because of course that tells you what this principle being referred to says. All right, so let me say three more things by way of clarifying Singer's position. First off, look, in a way that Singer very famously recognizes and articulates, his position has radical practical implications. It implies that almost all contemporary meat eating is wrong and almost all contemporary animal experimentation is wrong. I mean, it's not that on Singer's view it is in principle impossible ever to justify eating meat or experimenting on animals, but rather on his view such a justification is very hard to give, right? Because look, what you've got to be able to do is you've got to take animal interest, count them just as much as the like human interest, right? So you have to weigh, you know, the suffering caused to animals when they're produced via factory farming against benefits that accrue to humans who eat them, right? Singer plausibly claims, I mean, if you put those things together and sort of weigh them on the same scale, then it's most unlikely that meat eating turns out to be justified most of the time. Right? Similarly for animal experimentation, right? I mean, so of course, if it were the case that by experimenting on 10 animals you could dramatically reduce suffering for millions of people and millions of other animals, on Singer's view that would be okay, right? But his point about animal experimentation is, in fact, it's almost never like that, right? And in fact, most of the time animal experimentation predictably causes great suffering for animals and doesn't very obviously lead to immediate and great benefits for anybody, right? And of course the kinds of animal experimentation that Singer and others in the animal, we'll be careful with this term for reasons that we'll come to in a bit, but as you might say in the animal rights movement, point to a sort of paradigm examples of wrong animal experimentation involve things like the testing of shampoos and stuff on rabbits, right? So the idea is that, well, I forget the name of this test now, but there's a test whereby you check how bad for the eyes a shampoo is, right? By dripping it into the eyes of rabbits until half of them turn blind, right? The advantage of a rabbit for this purpose is they don't tear, right? And so what Singer, sounds very plausible, says is, look, I mean, we don't need new shampoos badly enough to do that to rabbits, right? Okay, so first point then about Singer's position is that it has these quite radical practical implications. Second thing, it is natural, but it turns out mistaken, to articulate Singer's view by saying, oh, he's terribly against killing animals. He actually isn't, right? So look, what Singer argues for directly is the view that animal suffering and pleasure counts morally just as much as human suffering and pleasure. He does not explicitly argue for any position about the value of animal lives or about the rightness or wrongness of killing animals as against killing humans. Right? His position is directly and immediately only about, pleasure and pain, suffering and happiness. Whatever, right? And indeed, if you look in, it didn't come out really in the piece you have, but you look in other places, for instance, in his book Practical Ethics, you discover that Singer is open to, rather actually inclined to embrace a position that implies that it is more wrong to kill human beings than it is to kill animals. Right? He thinks that the cognitive capacities that typical human beings have that typical animals lack may make it more wrong to kill those human beings than it would be to kill non-human animals. Right? So his position is not, sort of one point is it's not directly and immediately about the wrongness of killing at all, right? And actually, when you explore it, it turns out that he's much more open to the view that it's specially wrong to kill humans than he is open to the view that human pain in and of itself is worse than animal pain. Okay, third point. There's a way in which, though this hasn't sort of always been recognized or hasn't always been at the forefront of philosophical consciousness, there's a way in which Singer's position on this topic is sort of the natural utilitarian position. Right? There are two ways to see that. One is historical. So, I mean, if you look at the writings of the great classical utilitarians, Bentham, Mill, and Sidgwick, all of them, in their different ways, are committed to the idea that animal pleasure and pain count as much as, well, in the same way as human pleasure and pain. Right? For Bentham and Sidgwick, who, as you saw, Singer quotes, it's more straightforward. Right? For Mill, there's a complication, right? It's a complication that we've encountered, right, involving the higher and lower pleasure stuff. Because, of course, as we saw, the higher and lower pleasure stuff is sort of precisely meant in a way to make, to argue that these distinctively human pleasures count more than the animal ones do. Right? Nonetheless, I mean, Mill is committed to the view that, as it were, an animal pleasure or pain felt by a human being counts no more than an animal pleasure or pain felt by an animal. Right? In that way, he is, as Bentham and Sidgwick are, sort of committed to animal equality. So one piece of evidence that something like Singer's views of the natural utilitarian position is that it is, in fact, with those qualifications about Mill, it is, in fact, the position of the three great classical utilitarians. The other way to see that is sort of to, you can just rehearse this bit of kind of abstract argument to persuade yourself that it's the natural utilitarian view. I mean, just think like this, right? Look, if you're a utilitarian, what are you concerned with? Well, you're concerned about, bringing about maximizing happiness and preventing unhappiness or pain, right? If that's what you're interested in, right, it sort of seems arbitrary and unreasonable to restrict your concern to happiness or pain when they occur in human beings and not be concerned about them when they occur in animals, right? That seems like an odd way to develop the view, whereas, it seems very natural, on the other hand, to develop the view by being concerned about pain and pleasure, as it were, wherever you find them, whether you find them in human beings or in non-human animals. All right, so that's Singer's argument, Singer's position. Yeah. What I now want to do is develop a line of criticism. Now, I should say two things about it before I go into it. One is, in the end, as you'll see, the import, I think, of this line of criticism is not that Singer's position is wrong, it's that he doesn't argue for it in the best way. The second thing is, this is one of these characteristic multi-stage deals that you quite often find in philosophy, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm first going to raise an objection, then second I'm going to give what I take to be, the response you would predict Singer would give to the objection, then I'm going to have a response to the response, right? So it's going to be a multi-stage, multi-layered deal, okay? All right. Start then with the objection. The objection goes like this, initial version. When Singer says that this principle of equal consideration of interest is the only principle that adequately explains why discrimination among humans is wrong, he's mistaken. Because here's another principle that could do it just as well. If we pop over the PowerPoint here, consider the principle of equal consideration of interest, and then do this. Okay. You can develop the principle of equal consideration of human interests by just substituting in human before being in that principle, right? So you know, principle of equal consideration of human interests will say the interest of every human being affected by an action to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interest of any other human being. We're going to switch away from the PowerPoint here. So then see the argument goes like this, right? So the person making the objection says, look, what you said in premise 2 is wrong, right? It's not true that the principle of equal consideration of interest is the only principle that will adequately explain why discrimination among humans is wrong. Because look, this principle of equal consideration of human interest will do just as good a job. Because, after all, if we're considering discrimination among humans, then the principle of equal consideration of human interest says exactly the same thing as the principle of equal consideration of interest does. Has exactly the same implications for when discrimination is wrong, because after all, you know, the restriction to human beings makes no difference in that sphere of application, right? But, of course, if that's the principle you appeal to, then the second half of the argument ain't going to work, right? Because, you know, in the second half of the argument, the principle of equal consideration of human interest does not tell you anything about it being wrong to discriminate against animals. Yeah? Okay, you with me so far then? Does everyone understand the objection? All right, good. So how might Singer respond then? Well, I mean, it's not as if Singer considers exactly this objection in exactly this form. Nonetheless, on the basis of, you know, a whole bunch of what he says on this topic, I think you can make a reasonable prediction about what he would likely say if faced with this objection. What he would likely say is this: it's not true that the principle of equal consideration of human interest does just as good a job of explaining why discrimination among humans is wrong as the original principle of equal consideration of interest did. He'd say, I mean, it's true that it has the same implications, but it's not true that it does just as good a job of explaining why discrimination among humans is wrong. And it doesn't do just as good a job because it's a less good principle. Right? It's a less good principle because, unlike the original principle of equal consideration of interest, it involves this arbitrary and unjustifiable restriction of concern to the biologically human. Right? It involves giving moral significance to the fact that you're a member of a moral species, of a particular species, in a way that you shouldn't do. That was a bit complicated, maybe, so let me do it again. Right? So, the thought here in Singer's predicted response, right, is that when you're deciding how good a job a certain principle does of justifying stuff, there are two things you've got to focus on, right? One of them is, what are the implications of the principle, right? But the other is, how plausible is the principle itself? So Singer could we'll have to grant to the person making the objection that it's true that the implications for cases of discrimination among humans of the principle of equal consideration of human interest are just the same as the implications of the principle of equal consideration of interest are, right? But he can say, nonetheless, it doesn't do as good a job, because again, it's not as plausible a principle. It doesn't have that other thing going for it, right? Why is it not as plausible a principle? Well, it's not as plausible a principle because it involves, in a way the principle of equal consideration of interest doesn't, this, as Singer would see it, arbitrary restriction of concern to the biologically human. Right? So that's why it's a less good principle. So that's why it does a less good job of justification. Still with me? Yeah? All right, well, good. Okay, so third step. What I want to say at the third stage is given what, as we just saw, Singer has to say to defend his argument against this objection, there turns out to be a simpler and better way to argue for his position than the one he actually adopts. So here's the deal, right? He's committed, as we just saw in responding to the objection, to making this claim, it's arbitrary and unreasonable to base your concern for something on whether it's biologically human or not. Right? So take that claim that he's committed to making anyway, right? And then just put it together with the kind of doesn't even need to be actually a full hedonistic principle, but the kind of thing that utilitarians and their opponents actually often agree on, which is even if pain and pleasure aren't the only things that are morally important, they're certainly among the things that are morally important. Right? So put together the idea that pain and pleasure are morally important with this idea that it's arbitrary and unreasonable to restrict your concern on the basis of biological species. And you've got a way to argue for counting animal interests as much as you count human interests, which is what Singer wants. Right? And you've got a way to argue for it without committing yourself to this claim that the principle of equal consideration of interest is what justifies your opposition to discrimination among human beings. Right? You've got, as it were, a more direct and I think a less problematic way to make the argument that, well, to justify the position Singer wants to justify. It's a bit of a complicated multi-stage deal, so let me do it for you one more time. Okay. So first stage was the objection, right? So the objection was premise 2 is mistaken, and when you see how premise 2 is mistaken, you see the whole argument falls apart, right? And the thought was, premise 2 is mistaken because Singer's wrong that the only principle that adequately explains why discrimination among humans is wrong is the principle of equal consideration of interests. The principle of equal consideration of human interests will do just as well. But if you use the principle of equal consideration of human interest, then the argument breaks down, because at the second stage, that principle doesn't say that there's anything wrong with discriminating against animals. So that was the first step. Right? Second step was Singer's predicted response to that. Right? Singer's predicted response is to say, it's not true that the principle of equal consideration of human interest does just as good a job of explaining why discrimination among humans is wrong as the original principle of equal consideration of interest did. It's not true, because even though the principle of equal consideration of human interest has just the same implications for discrimination among humans as the principle of equal consideration of interest did, it doesn't do as good a job of explaining why it's wrong, because it's not as good a principle. It's not as good a principle because, unlike the original version, it contains this arbitrary and unreasonable restriction of concern to the biologically human. Then third stage was the suggestion that if you are sort of anyway committed to making that reply, then there's really a simpler and better way to make the case for the position to which Singer's committed, right? Because now he's anyway committed to saying it's arbitrary and unreasonable to restrict your concern to the biologically human. Put that together with the very plausible sort of, this isn't full hedonism, it's the more defensible thing that almost everyone thinks, the idea that pain and pleasure are important, right? Then you've got an argument for counting animal pain and pleasure just as much as human pain and pleasure, and that's what Singer wants to argue for. Right? So my claim is you've got a sort of cleaner, simpler, better way to argue for his conclusion. Now, any questions about any of that? Yeah.
You said that this seems kind of linked to Marquis' pro-life argument, not in the sense that that it goes from the same premise, but that it establishes that biologically human is not a prerequisite for.
Interesting. No, actually, not in that way either. Let me see if I can find the look. The link to Marquis really is a link in terms of characteristic argument structure. And let me. I don't now remember whether the bit of Marquis where he draws this comparison is in the right thing to do. But let me look. Yeah, it isn't. But I mean, it as far as I can tell, but it is in the original piece, right? Well, the thing that Marquis says, right, is the argument is structurally analogous, right? It's structurally analogous in this way, right? Just as Singer's strategy is to start by asking what makes it wrong to discriminate among human beings, and then, without directly focusing on animals, and then take the answer he gets there, this principle of equal consideration of interests, and then argue that it has direct implications for the moral treatment of animals, right? Two-stage deal, justify a principle without special reference to the case of animals, then argue that it turns out to have these important implications for the treatment of animals, right? So, explicitly modeling himself on that, Marquis's anti-abortion argument is start with, again, not directly abortion, but something we all agree about, the wrongness of killing human beings like us, right? Ask what makes it wrong to kill adult human beings like us. You get an answer, right? Which you've justified without direct, immediate reference to the abortion case, and then claim in the second stage, but when you understand this principle, it implies that abortion is prima facie seriously wrong, right? So it's that structural analogy that Marquis explicitly draws attention to. They're not in the extract from Marquis that we have in our anthology. And as I said earlier, I mean, a third argument actually that we've encountered that has the same, again, this one I didn't think worked at all, right? But I mean, it's supposed to have the same form was Rachel's argument against ethical egoism, where what you did was you justified this, articulated this charge of unacceptable arbitrariness by focusing on racism and stuff, right? And that had nothing specially to do with ethical egoism. And then sort of, again, the second stage of the argument, the claim was, and look, ethical egoism turns out to be unacceptably arbitrary in just the way that these other bad things are. Right? Again, it was that same two-stage thing. First off, justify a principle or a principle about what makes things wrong or whatever it is, without special reference to the case you're ultimately interested in. And then, second stage, argue, but when you see how it works, you'll see that this principle that you've justified in this independent way turns out to have the implications you want for the case you're ultimately interested in. Yeah? That makes sense? Okay. Anything else? All right, well, that's a good time to stop on the thing, and when we come back, we'll talk about Machen.